I said I've come to Ireland, the only place in the world I should be speaking at a slow rate. And I still can't. So, going to have a little discussion about what we mean by this inclusion. We've talked a lot about it, obviously, today. This differentiation. So I said this morning about having a whole curriculum for all children. And obviously we have a lot of adaptations that need to be made to that for some things, for some children. And there are some aspects of the learning profile that with having Down syndrome that are going to be very general across the board, but of course there's huge variability within the children, and so it's going to be very much based on their individual needs. So we're going to talk about adapting teaching in the classroom setting to meet the needs of our children, who's going to be involved, whose jobs are it in the UK. It's in some ways a very different system and in some ways exactly the same, as we've just heard from Fidelma. We can get into different roles of professionals and qualifications. I've got some examples to show you, and then just a case study if we've got time I just might share as an example. So, the importance of this is about belonging to your school and your school community. We know about the academic progress, but this is what's most important, if you like. Being of equal value, everybody in this local community is entitled to go to this school, and so should our children be. Recognition of the same needs and rights, removals of barriers to enable the children to participate in the lessons and to have a free expression within their learning. And using the framework of the curriculum as a basis, and then looking at how we need to adapt it. When I'm talking about educational targets, so to become socially competent, learn the social rules, manage emotions and make friends, and that came up after the talk this morning. We will be definitely, the children will be in mainstream schools following mainstream lessons, differentiated, but alongside that, running through all of that, is this independence and behaviour. It's happening all day, every day, in everyday situations. So we're not taking them off to teach them about behaviour. They're learning how it works in the setting as they go through, just like everybody else is. We may notice that there are some bits we need to do a bit of extra work on, but generally it's going to be happening all day, every day. We also know, getting off topic, we also know that the children have difficulty generalising new learning, so actually teaching them separately and not within everyday activities, you're then going to have to teach them how to generalise it, which we know they find tricky. So actually doing it in the all day, every day, is definitely how we have the model for all children, and it's the model that we're accessing with our children with Down syndrome. So that's probably the most important thing about school inclusion. Second up there, definitely important, to develop language and literacy skills, to develop math skills, to learn about the world, science, history, geography, and I think sometimes we get a bit more focused on that and lose sight of the bigger picture. To develop physical abilities, so in physical education, engage in art, drama, music, and those types of subjects. To find their own strengths, develop their self-esteem and their self-confidence, just the same as everybody else. What do we want to do when we leave school? We talked about thinking about leading our learning into where we're going to go in the future, just like we are for all children. We can argue how well we do that for all children, but it's exactly the same for our children. So when we're looking at adapting these teaching in the classroom, looking at the social strengths, we know the children are often very social. The communication is their strength. They may not be great with the speech and language skills, but in terms of wanting to communicate, wanting to be with others, wanting attention, wanting to be part of what's going on, that's a real strength area for our children. We want to encourage that all the way through. And we'll be asking our teachers to have high expectations of behaviour, exactly the same as they have for everybody else in the class. They are going to go through our society at the same rate as at the same age levels as their peers. They're going to hit puberty at the same age as their peers. It's really important that we follow that through. The other thing to think about when we come to behaviour and social skills, this is their strength area. And if you've got a child who's 6, they are going to have intellectual disability. They are going to be having some things they find more difficult, but they still have 6 years experience of how this world works and how people work. And this is what they're good at. So I can't say strongly enough, and maybe you're right, maybe sometimes we take for granted how much we expect these high expectations to be there from the beginning, and we need to do some more work on making sure parents are supported to have those expectations as well. Obviously we have cognitive delays, so we want smaller steps. Breaking things down, any targets down into smaller steps is often very, very helpful. Looking at daily interactions, records of progress, and making sure the children have lots of opportunity for practice and repetition. We know that they're going to have delayed speech and language development, so we need activities with instructions at an appropriate language learning level, and language teaching and speech work should be a priority all the way through, and will be, hopefully, particularly if you're doing lots of literacy work throughout the day, will be being worked on all of the time. I'm going to keep going. Short-term memory difficulties, their visual short-term memory is much better than their verbal short-term memory. So one of the big key adaptations when looking at schools is schools are better now than they probably ever have been for being more visual. But they are still predominantly learning from listening environments. As you go through school, it gets more and more and more. And actually, that input of the lesson is often the biggest challenge for our children with Down syndrome. Even if they sit there and listen as hard as they can and try and process as fast as they can, they will not be able to take that information in. And that's when we need to go, okay, well, what do they need? What adaptations do we need to make sure that they can take some of that information in? And that's where we're going to start looking at our visuals. And we're going to go through some examples of that. And motor delays. Influence play, learning and social activities, being able to play football, chase the ball, be involved in rounders or baseball or whatever it is, being able to count out in maths, being able to write and record with your pencil has a big impact. And if you have a child with those sorts of motor delays, those sorts of adaptations will need to be considered in every lesson. Adaptive seating. So some of the children will have to have different sized chairs to provide adequate support, to make sure that their feet are on the floor, and again, if you're all sitting on the carpet, I'm going to need my chair. Well, if I'm on my chair and I need to talk to somebody next to me, I need somebody else on a chair as well. So it's not just thinking about what they need in terms of physical, but also the implication that's going to have for social. When I talk about differentiation, we're talking about the process which allows students to access a common curriculum and includes any modifications made by the teacher or assistant to respond to student diversity. Which sounds very posh, I think, but it might be that the learning objective for the lesson, what everybody's going to learn in the class, is totally appropriate for our child with Down syndrome. That might be the case. We don't have to differentiate anything. It might be that we have to look at the content. How much are we providing? I know somebody said that earlier. Reducing the amount that's there and the level of it. The process. How are they going to access some of the input? How are they going to then, what are they going to do in terms of producing? What's the rest of the class producing? Are they all writing long, lovely stories? What about our child? How are we going to adapt that outcome for them? Is it that somebody's going to write down their ideas for them? Is it that they're going to use the computer? Is it that they're going to use written word cards, do some sentence matching for our younger children? Is it that they're going to use an audio recorder? Any of those things would come under differentiation for us. And looking at the learning environment, so where are they with everybody else? Making sure they are part of that group, making sure that they are working with a partner, that they have access to that social curriculum as well. We know that the children differ widely in their understanding, abilities and skills, just like all children, but these general principles are useful when looking at, okay, we're going to be doing an input on, I already know that's going to be the most difficult thing, I already know we need some visual supports, I already know that the ones we have for the rest of the class are not clear enough, they won't be able to see them given their vision or they're too small. We already know some of that information, but in knowing the individual child, what do they like, what are they good at, what supports them, what strategies have they been using, and what resources do they know. It's not helpful to think of them like younger children. Oh, I know they're 8, but their learning level, where they're working at I'm going to go and see what they're doing 2 years ago in the classroom. That's not helpful, because if you end up doing a separate programme or different to what the rest of the class are doing, it makes it very, very hard for the children to be included. So if the group are doing Shakespeare, and you go, oh wow, I don't think they're gonna get to grips with Shakespeare. I think we'll go and get the Gruffalo. That's going to mean that any activity that the class do now over the next 4 weeks on Shakespeare, they're going to struggle to be included on, because they're working on something completely different, which is why we're always going, what's everybody else in the room doing? How can we adapt to that first?
This behavior, the same like younger children, that's where you have, oh, they're just children. They're just like 3 years old.
Oh, when they're little, they like to get up and wander around. Well, that's not what we do at school. Nobody else does it at school.
Yeah.
You can't do it either. I am known, I think, as very smiley and friendly looking, but really being quite mean and strict. When the children come to groups, I have to manage a group of children. They have to follow the rules of the group. And we have lots and lots of experience of the children doing very well in the groups, but sometimes getting into the group and getting out of the group can be tricky. And parents will say to me, oh, Becky, will you go and do that thing you do? And I'll say, well, I can, but I'm certainly not coming home with you tonight. So I think maybe we need to have a look at what it is that I'm doing that means that in this group they come in and they're participating, and what's going on elsewhere that means that they can't. I have a child at the moment who's just gone into our junior school, so there'll be 7, who does have some additional things going on, but school are struggling. They've moved into junior school, an entire different group of adults, new teachers, new teaching assistant, and when we went in for our first visit, actually before the first visit, 2 weeks into term, they came to training and they came up and said, oh, we need help. She's not really in the classroom, she's distracting other children, she won't sit and engage in the activities, we don't know what to do. So obviously, first visit of the term is down to you. And we also took a video of her in the group. Now this group she's been coming to since she was preschool. It's only once a month, but she's very, very familiar with the expectations of the group. She comes in, she sits down, occasionally she stands up, but she never leaves her place, she sits back down again. We have some reward motivation strategies going on. The activities change frequently, but they're doing activities, they're not sitting for long periods listening. She's fab. In fact, best person in the group. So we can go, okay, what's happening here that's not happening here? And one is the level of the work. It's not appropriately being presented to her. And the second thing is that expectation. Because she'll learn very quickly, if I get up and walk out of the classroom, I'm allowed to play with a ball. I'm not staying in here, especially not if nobody's going to even try and get me back. That just teaches me, well, come and go as I like. And we're going to have those same expectations for everyone. Oh, getting off on a behaviour thing, sorry.
May I ask something?
Yes.
What do you think about because of the technological development and the social media and the other YouTube like this, all people are more visual learners than from listening or reading. Therefore, nowadays it must not be so hard, so difficult to adapt a curriculum as a visual thing, because for the other children also they are more visual learners right now, because they prefer watching some videos rather than reading about it.
That doesn't mean that it is right all the time.
Not right, but this is the fact, I think.
Yeah.
What about your observation about other children without disabilities, without Down syndrome?
Well, like I say, the classes are becoming, classrooms generally are becoming much more visual, and they're using much more of those strategies with interactive whiteboards connected to the internet. They have iPads in school, access to laptops. That's all going on for all the other children, as it is for our child with Down syndrome. I think it's really important to use those as much as possible. I think YouTube can be a curse and also a blessing in terms of going, this is what we're going to do in science today. This is what we're going to do in science today. I can actually see what's happening. But also, you're going to have 29 other children in there, maybe 25, let's go by 25, other children in there who are going to show you what to do. So using the children as the teaching models, I think is really, really, really valuable. Just showing them. What we don't want is another adult to come over and sit down and start saying the same thing over again. We didn't get it the first time because it was too complicated. Telling us again isn't necessarily going to be the best way for us to get it.
And also, I think that we have to take in a different way the aspect of the adaptation of the curriculum and the content. Another aspect that are the strategy that we can use in education to help more the people with intellectual disability. It's not the same thing. Are two aspects of teaching. One is concentrate some contents and decide what are the priority in the contents. Another aspect are what kind of strategies we can use in mainstream school to help the people with intellectual disability to learn better. We don't have to confuse these two aspects.
I think I understood. Because lots of what we're talking about, the visual supports, is going to support any child with speech language difficulty who will guaranteed also have memory difficulties with their verbal short-term memory. So lots of this will be useful for all of the children. We want to be following age-appropriate content, like I mentioned with the Shakespeare and the Gruffalo. As the children are, let's take reading, as the children are learning to read, whilst we might have 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds who are still struggling at reading, they're not going to want to be reading about Mum, Dad, what we have, Chip, Biff and Floppy the dog. That wasn't interesting. Well, it might have been interesting when we were 5. If we've been doing it for the last 10 years, it's definitely not going to be interesting and motivating for us. I want to make sure we are providing age-appropriate content for them. Right. So teachers need to understand the profile. We want support with listening skills, working on language skills, so always thinking, what do we need to develop in terms of speech and language? What are our speech and language targets? How can we match that to the differentiation of the curriculum? And use activities and resources that are engaging for the individual, that are something for them to do and be involved with. I think I've said that. Learning about the individual through records, interaction and teaching. So for us, our children have what we now call an EHCP, an Education, Health and Care Plan. It has replaced what were statements, and it will state in there, it will come, what the local authority do is to gather reports from everybody working with the child, or they'll get in some new agencies to do an initial assessment of the child, so speech and language therapist, educational psychologist. They've been at preschool, there'll be a preschool teacher section. They've been at school, there'll be a school teacher section, and a parent input into the report. And then somebody, once you start school, it will be somebody at school will review that, and it will state in there all of the extra hours of support, speech and language input resources that are recommended for this child. And then that goes with them through school, and it's reviewed normally on a yearly basis.
Yearly basis.
Yeah, when they start school, they do a 6-month review, but then it's reviewed once a year. And everybody needs to obviously have access to that. Learning about the individuals, that's from the heads to the teachers to the teaching assistants. And maybe now is a good time to say, in the UK, we would typically have a class of up to 30 children. And for that 30 children, for our 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, you would have a classroom teacher, a qualified teacher, and in that room you'd have a teaching assistant, who is another adult who's in there to provide support directed by the teacher for anybody else. They might do a bit of small group work. I know some teaching assistants who would tell you that 20 years ago their job was washing up the paint pots, and now it might be taking an able group of children in the class. So it's changed a lot for our teaching assistants. For our child with Down syndrome, they will be allocated a set number of hours of additional adult support. That would typically be between 15 and 30. Both the classroom teaching assistant and our individual teaching assistant have to have absolutely no formal qualifications whatsoever. So they could be that they used to be a teacher. Schools have lucked in if they get somebody apply for the job who used to be a teacher. I had somebody who used to be a deputy head. Or it could be a mum who happens to have children, or a dad who happens to have children at the same school and is looking for a job that fits in with dropping off and picking up in the school day. Yes, so the idea of the model is it's very much led by the teacher. It's just an extra pair of hands to support, guided by the teacher in terms of learning. And I will say, just like you mentioned earlier, I have some assistants who are fantastic and have loads of qualifications and are a teacher, and I have some other assistants who are fantastic who have just learnt on the job and have the kind of positive can-do attitude and take on board, go on training, and are excellent. And I can say I've got the other opposite as well, which is tricky. It definitely is. But all of those adults need to be working with the child. I have some schools who are moving to more of a model of we have 3 adults in the classroom, we will move around and work with everybody. Nobody is associated with one person, which I think is a very positive thing. But for generally speaking, that one-to-one will be with the child with Down syndrome most of the time, stepping back as much as possible. And that's one of the big jobs of my role, is getting that level of understanding that just because you're there to support this child doesn't mean you need to be there supporting this child. You need to be making resources. You need to be getting the visual pictures that we're going to need for next week. My favourite thing to get them to do is observations from the other side of the room, because then they're doing something but they're not with the child. So it does a kind of double whammy for me. It gets them to look at where the child is struggling, what they're finding that they're quite successful with, but also they might be able to pick up, okay, they're not speaking to the other children, or they needed a pencil but they didn't ask for one. So I can put that on my observation sheet, and I know I can go back and look at teaching some language skills.
As a new objective.
For that. It is my objective. I like independent objectives. And understanding that if you can go off and have a cup of tea, that means you've done your job to the best of your ability. You're not needed for that. 10 minutes, that's great.
Sorry, what is statutory assessment? Statement from?
Yeah. So, to get an idea of the child, everybody needs to be working with the child. Everybody needs to be involved in discussions with parents. They will all have access to this statement or EHCP, and that's what we now call the statutory assessment. Is what we now call the EHCP. So it means
Health.
Education, Health and Care Plan. I'm still
Okay.
getting my head around it. And I swear to you, some of them are no different to statements. Won't go
Yeah.
into that. There'll be other people working in partnerships that are coming into school through interaction with the pupil, obviously most importantly, and learning about attention, motivation, behaviour and strategies that help the pupil. I think sometimes my children get a little bit of a raw deal in terms of it's expected that they haven't got great attention and focus skills. So the children who come to the preschool groups will sit in groups of up to 4 for 45 minutes, and as you know, I like to talk a lot, let's say some of them up to an hour. They have great focus and attention as far as I'm concerned, as long as the activity is small steps, engaging for the children, pitched at an appropriate level. We're talking about being in a mainstream classroom and there's a lot of talking going on, their attention is not going to be held there for very long. Because really we're just asking them to sit. And that's very, very challenging for lots of people, myself included, when you're not sure what's going on. And certainly for our young children with Down syndrome. What I started to say was that's how it looks in terms of support in the early years. As the children move through school, that teaching assistant, general classroom teaching assistant starts to drop off. So you typically would have somebody in there for just the morning, and the teacher will be in there on their own in the afternoons. But our one-to-one support for our child with Down syndrome would stay constant throughout infants, junior and into secondary schools. We encourage all the children to have a pupil passport, and actually that's become part of the new code of practice, that the children have a pupil profile. It's just a very simple, it's supposed to be 1 page, although I'd say some of them are more like 2-page, information sheet to go to teachers, particularly at secondary school level. That can be really, really helpful, because you've got to get around 14 different teachers, and they're not all going to read your EHCP, which might be about this thick by the time you get to secondary school, but they will hopefully have a look at that 1-page pupil passport. And it will include all of that key information about the child, medical information, family and friends to talk about, strengths, things that they find tricky, and strategies and resources that they use.
What do you mean developed by the child?
Normally it would be so the child can share it with an adult. So it doesn't say, it stops it saying things like, oh, Becky is really bad at da-da-da-da-da. She struggles with number. The idea of it is you can go, oh, I'm working with you today. Oh, I see, you're great at working up to 10. You use Numicon to do your maths activities. And, oh, you're a fantastic word reader. So I know I can use print to support your learning throughout this lesson. So it's designed like the child's sharing it themselves. This is what I'm good at. So it'd say, be written in the first person. I am good at working with numbers up to 10. I am.
It's as if.
Yes. Yes.
It sounds like the child should develop it.
Well, as they get older, certainly they would be involved
Okay.
with it, we'd hope. But certainly for the little ones,
Yeah, so
Yeah.
as if.
yeah. We want to keep records of achievement. There is a huge pressure on schools in terms of making progress. We want to make sure that the smaller steps of progress that our children make are equally measured and captured. So we don't get to the end of term or the end of the year and we say, oh, so what progress have they made? Oh, we don't have evidence to show any. They've done their assessment with the rest of the class and it hasn't shown any improvement from last year because the levels are designed for typically developing children, not to capture smaller steps. So we need to make sure we have appropriate assessments. Some of the children have 2 records of that, one to take home and to show parents and to get eaten by the dog, and the other one stays at school as a record in case anybody comes in to check up on what's going on. We'll be keen to set targets and assess vocabulary learning within the classroom. So if you're doing a topic on ancient Greece, you might set yourself 8 vocabulary words to do with ancient Greece that your child doesn't know yet. And at the end of that topic, if they know them, wow, great, you can show them learn 8 out of 10 vocabulary words on ancient Greece. I've got something to share in terms of their progress. And it should be a celebration of new practical skills. And I know the children like sharing their records when I go into school and I say, well, what have you been doing? What have you been learning about? They're a really nice visual support that supports their talking and explaining about what they've been doing and demonstrates some of their excellent knowledge. We need to engage them visually, supporting that listening and enhancing understanding. So using, all of the children should have a written objective that says what they're going to learn in this lesson. And that should be the same for our child with Down syndrome. It might not be the same written objective, but they should have, this is what the child is expected to learn within this lesson, and then the teaching assistant can feed back how they got on with that. So it might say, Becky is expected to answer the following 20 questions using her 10 times table knowledge. And it might say, first 10 completed with support using Numicon, second 10 achieved independently. And it might be that the first 10 are all correct and the second 10 are all wrong. But that shows me, 1, what the child can do with a bit of support, and most importantly, what they can do on their own. And if they sat there and worked on their own alongside their peers on those 10 questions, that's a huge tick in terms of our independence and independent learning. Using visual gestural augmentation, so extra pictures for the children, actual objects for the children, the use of computing technology, so the iPad, the laptop, to show the children what's going to be happening, use of photos to share what they've done about their work rather than necessarily having to complete a maths worksheet. There's photos of the child having done the sums physically. Visual support. What are you going to ask me, Tanya?
Word and sentences. Are we there? Word and sentences?
Differentiation.
Words and sentences, yeah. So we need lots of words and sentences for the children to read, write, show or stick. So we know that visual is their strength. We'll be doing lots of use of the print to support their understanding and their learning. Once they're readers, I want to be giving them information in simple text that they can access so they can read it, answer questions on it, look back on it. They haven't had to remember what the teacher said at the beginning of the lesson, because we know that's what's going to be a challenge. Having some simple information written down, or it might be in picture form, is going to be essential for the children. Supporting them to write and make a visual record of what they've done, so they can go back over it when you get your book out the next lesson. We look back at what we did, we've got the print there, we can practice it in exactly the same way to reinforce that learning. Having a clear visual and written plan for the pupil, so they know exactly what they've got to do in the lesson. It was interesting hearing about, I'm going to call him Carl, however you say it with your Irish accent, talking about his list of jobs to do when he gets to work. That's how they started, by teaching him. He didn't have to remember. He had it all written down so he could take it off to his to complete around his work. Exactly the same for our children. You go in, says on the desk what I need to get out. I don't need to wait for somebody else to come along and tell me. It's there written down for me. In maths today, you're going to need your maths book, your calculator, your pencil, your Numicon, sitting at your desk ready to go, whatever it is. So it's written there for the children, or visually supported with pictures. And lots of reward and praise, of course. Everybody likes to know that they're on track and doing the right thing. Individualised teaching. This has come up obviously already a lot today. Too much of that working one-to-one with an adult can reduce that exposure to age-appropriate models of behaviour, language and opportunities for pupil-pupil interaction. If I have a table like this, the last thing I want to see is a child sat here and an adult sat here, because that means they can't then talk to anybody else. They've got to be in there with everybody else. So I really would like my teaching assistants not to have chairs. But if they have to, I'll let them have one on the end that they have to move away from. And those who say, oh, they're working on their own, I'm just here doing my own thing. No, you're still there. You have to go away. You have to leave them and let them get on. Can lead to social exclusion and a sense of feeling different. People don't want to come and talk to me, don't bother coming to talk to me because I've got this adult here. Or even worse, if they've got something to say to me, they'll come and say it to the adult. So they'll come and say, oh, Mrs. Baxter, here's Becky's water bottle. Oh, does so-and-so want a pencil? Well, ask them. They're there. And they have to be redirecting that, or better still, not be there at all. Not be there in the first place. And also, working one-to-one with an adult is incredibly demanding for the pupil. Nobody else in class has a pair of eyes on them all the time going, and now the next sum, and now the next sum, and now the next sentence, and what are you going to write about this? Oh, you stopped writing, keep going, keep going, keep going. They're all doing a bit of work, having a chat to their friends, sharing ideas. It's incredibly intense for the children, and they need adults to back off. And the same for the assistant. They need to back off too. I thought it was interesting what was said earlier about the child having worked with the same adult for 6 years and then going off to secondary school, and the child being very, very upset and lost. I also see the opposite. Child going off to secondary school, fantastic, look at what I'm doing here. And the adult, oh, I've been working with them today, how am I going to miss you? That's not a teacher relationship. Do you see the teacher doing that with anybody else? That's moved into a relationship above what it should be to be teacher and professional. And we have to look very carefully at that. Keeping the children busy, massive support for behaviour. Too slow, if things are going very slowly for the children, they obviously become bored, frustrated, have a lack of motivation, and that's when we start to see behaviour problems. And often when I get called in about behaviour, people will say, oh Becky, it comes out of nowhere, there's no pattern to it at all. And I think, well, let's have a look. I bet there is. We might not be able to identify it yet, but is it when there's a lot of talking going on? Is it when the child's not getting any attention from their peers? Is it when they don't know what they've got to do? And 9 times out of 10, is it that there's a speech and language need missing? And I would say 9 times out of 10 is probably underestimating. That will be responsible for behaviour. That's why it's happening, and we need to have a look at that. So improving the pace, having activity, the lesson broken down into smaller tasks. So if they're in an hour's lesson, it will be broken down into 10 smaller jobs. Might be write the title, get your book out, write the title, and the long date, job number 1. Tick that off, on to the next one. So we can see ourselves working through it. Having something ready if they finish earlier than expected. That's always a good one in lessons like art. You're going to spend an hour drawing a flower. You might be. It's going to take me about 3 minutes to draw that flower. We're going to need to know it's going to be a short activity and what we're going to do to support it. And having some breaks and reward success with special activities, particularly in the early years, that might be important. And those special activities will be things like a hand gym activity or a speech and language game, if appropriate. For some children with more challenging behaviour, it might be more of a reward, but certainly as they move through school, we'll be trying to limit that. In terms of teaching reading, we'll be wanting to work on book reading, word reading, phonic skills, phonic-based reading, phonological awareness, And all of those things should be continuing throughout school until the children are really successful at those. And even then, I'd still be having new reading targets for new vocabulary. So for Shakespeare, they're going to be reading and recognising the main characters from the play, or main vocabulary that comes up in the play. And that's when you want to start bringing these targets into your differentiation. So they're not coming out to work on literacy, they're not coming out to work on number, it's within their differentiated plan. Writing, so their ability to put thoughts on the paper, there's some suggestions for activities there, and their ability to write by hand. So we know they often have motor skill, difficulties with motor skills. They may well have a handwriting program that they're working on in school. They certainly want daily practice of handwriting activities, and again, that doesn't have to be off doing your individual handwriting. Writing in every lesson is going to be fantastic handwriting progress. But we will have to think of different ways, as we mentioned earlier, to adapt recording. For maths, basic understanding of number concepts, counting procedures. Again, lots of activities we'll be doing on a regular daily basis. They need lots of practice of these, and that's what we want within their differentiated learning plan. So thinking about setting your reading, your literacy, reading, your writing, your maths targets. How do we then feed them in to what what we're doing within the classroom based on what everybody else is doing?
May I ask something
Yeah.
about math? When one class is in the dividings or subtract, multiplying some things, but still the child is struggling with adding, for example. How can we adapt the program of the class to the children? It's
So
not
if
possible.
everybody's doing a worksheet on times tables, we're doing a worksheet on adding. So they might be doing 7 times 3, we might be doing 3 add 3, or 7 add 3. So we just, that's your target to work on adding. Everybody else is doing a set of 20 calculations. You might do 10 calculations rather than 20. You might need some additional resources like the Numicon or the Stern or counters or however it is you're going to manipulate it.
But
everybody's doing that activity.
but
doing
still
the same.
while teacher teaching class something, she teaches
In front of them.
dividing or multiplying, and but yeah, you know,
if you're doing the input on multiplying, the child might be in there for the input. If they're doing, let's say they're doing 10 times table, they might have their 10 times table written down and they can read it out. They don't know it, they're just joining in because they've got it written down in front of them. They're learning to recognise numbers, so that's great practice for recognising numbers. They might be doing some number matching, but they're engaged on the topic. They might be doing, I don't know, 5 sevens. Anybody can tell me what 5 sevens are? Oh, Jack, come put it on the board. And what number is that, Becky? You read out. We're doing number recognition. Tell me that's a 3. I can't remember what I said. Did I say 5?
Right.
So they're reading it. They're reading out the numbers. So they're involved at their level, whilst you're teaching for somebody else's level. And I will say, I have done that for quite a long time, and I sometimes take for granted how easy I think that is, and how different it is for a lot of teachers. So I've been into schools where, so it's a child who's 10, and my favourite phrase, I say that sarcastically, is, oh, but Becky, the gap is getting wider. Going more slowly. Tell me about what's happening. The rest of the class are doing persuasive writing, but we can't do persuasive writing. How are we going to do that? We can't access persuasive writing. And I'll say, well, tell me about the task. What have they got to do? Well, it's on the board. They have to use strong adjectives. I said, well, do we know what adjectives are? I'm not sure. So, well, that could be our target, to name 5 adjectives and put it in a piece of writing, to do some sentences with those adjectives in it. And she looked at me and said, when you say it like that, it's the easiest thing in the world, isn't it? I went, well, it is when you're used to thinking like that. But when you go, oh, I've got a class of 30 and I've got to teach persuasive writing, it becomes much more of a challenge often until you're practiced. And like I said earlier, this term is the biggest challenge. Summer term, it's a breeze, because we've spent all year practicing about, it's a breeze. In lots of ways, it's a lot easier. Because people are used to thinking about, okay, so that can be our target for this half term, learning about adjectives and including adjectives in our writing. We can do that throughout writing about the Egyptians and throughout writing about the Greeks and throughout writing about, I don't know, anything, resistant materials in science, whatever's coming up. We can build all that in and we'll meet our target and get lots of practice and repetition. It takes a bit of creative thinking. Lots of drawings to hold attention. So when the class teacher is talking, the teaching assistant is writing down or drawing for the child to support their interest. We did a lesson on the ill effects of smoking. So we'll draw, so I'll say, oh, I'm not very good at remembering. Whilst we watch this video, I'm going to make some notes. Oh, look, draw on my board, and my drawing takes a lot to be desired, but a head with a red neck, sore throat. Oh, look, black blob, black lung. And then when we finish the video, we have a list of vocabulary that we're going to need to learn and some reinforcements and spellings there. They can then take that off and use that to do some work and start teaching them to do some note making for themselves as they get into secondary school.
But why not to prepare a picture before?
You could
If
do.
You know that they will do that. If teaching assistant was talking with the teacher, they could prepare for that story, and you could have everything ready. Not to spend time and drawing in front of the children, because you can't just have to draw some few things, but on the pictures what you already prepared.
Absolutely,
If
depends
you're
what you.
losing time, you know, you have to show.
Well, it
you have to
depends on what your aim for the activity is. So if the aim of the activity is to teach note taking, it might work very, very nicely, so that they can do it as they get older for themselves. Might be one of your targets. If it is to do some writing about the ill effects, they have to do a poster actually afterwards of the ill effects of smoking. Having some key pictures with the vocabulary prepared, perfect, absolutely perfect.
Because that's important, to have a good connection between the teacher and teaching assistant or
Essential.
parent who is preparing material adapted for the child.
And that they know far enough in advance to be able to have it ready. Absolutely, absolutely. That's just an example of a child doing some sticking, so they've stuck in their sentence so they can read it back. It's the children doing rather than somebody else writing it out for them. I mean, they have obviously written it out for them, but they had to put the words in the right order and stick them in. So they're doing and matching and thinking about their reading.
And then they
Yep. That's an example of some writing about the town and the country mouse. So you can see they've done some copywriting underneath. Copywriting, once your child is copywriting, that is an activity to be independent at doing. You need to copy that out. Okay. Off I go. And the other nice thing about this is that when they come back to it in their work, they have somebody else's writing they can read to go back over, because reading some of these words might obviously be a bit more tricky for them. That's just an example of a storyboard. I'm sure you'll all know those. Draw some pictures, write some key notes. There's some question words, sentences at the bottom there to prompt your ideas. You can develop that, and then I can do my writing using that. That's an example of a French vocabulary activity, just to say we use matching in the early years, and we still use it to teach some vocabulary later on for those children, particularly giving them the visual and that written board there. Anytime they come to do French, do weather, get that out, do a quick review, easy done. That's an example where the children were all looking at medication. So all the children had these empty boxes to look at on the table, and our child just cut some up and stuck them in their book, and then did their little, these are drugs, we call them medicines. That's their key bit of information that they've learnt in that lesson, but they've got those visuals there to remind them when they look back, oh, I remember this lesson, we looked at these things. tells you your list of what you need with your little visuals there as well, so they can do that bit independently, get themselves set up. Again, an example of maths and science. They've been around school taking photographs of real things that use electricity, and they've stuck them in their book to record their achievements, their work. This is a person, the whole class are doing a project on the water system. So they've done their project on the water system. So they found some pictures, they've used the computer, they've done a mind map, which we were talking about. With the keywords in the middle and the words you're linking to, your new vocabulary targets. If I can tell you what they are, if I can match them to the right picture, I'll show you what I've learnt about the water, about different water sources. Got a few pictures of me for a bit of motivation. I like watching myself talk about these things, which is great. So just to finish with this case study, we had a child who was 6 years, 2 months. We had a phone call from the school to say, Becky, things aren't going very well at all. Child is being disruptive. They're not making progress, and we don't think we can manage this situation anymore. We don't think this is the right school for them. So we were called in. This child had a history of hearing loss, so fluctuating conductive hearing loss. They had a vision impairment which hadn't been picked up until they were 5, probably 5.5, coming up to 6, and quite a significant vision impairment in the range of partial sight. So really quite significant, which probably says quite a lot about what was going on. We did an assessment of their speech and language, their reading. They had an awareness of print, but they really weren't reading any words. They had OT and occupational therapy and physiotherapy input because they had delayed fine and gross motor skills and some challenging behaviour, to be kind, I would say. So that's the sort of thing we will be doing. Positioning and access to resources to support hearing and vision. So they need access to a laptop to do some typing on. They did a nice touch typing program, actually. Print size. Things need to be blown up so the child can see them. They had a dome magnifier to be able to look over pictures and for it to enlarge pictures for them. Sitting them near the front of the class, not at the back, because we've got difficulties with hearing, difficulties with vision. I want to be somewhere near the front, maybe to the side, so I can get my access to extra support. Daily practice of reading, whole words, phonics and handwriting. Use of visual aids, visual timetables to support behaviour, having pre-written word cards that he can now do something with rather than listening. Developing record books and supported by written sentences so we could see what he'd learned, he could see what he'd learned, he could be proud of his achievements. Activities to target what we call IEP targets, or we used to call IEP targets. Individual education plan, which is your targets typically for a half term for 6 to 7 weeks. We don't specifically call them IEP targets anymore, but all schools should be keeping records of targets and progress on those. And the small steps with lots of rewards built in throughout all of his classes. Oh, I think it's time for a coffee. Anybody?